So our story for all ages this morning about the cats in Borneo was one of those humbling stories of a time when nature gets out of balance, maybe because of something humans have done, maybe just because, and then runaway growth of a plant or animal species causes all kinds of problems and disruption. A well-intentioned attempt to control mosquitoes causes a boom in the caterpillar population and then the rat population, and the result for the people of Borneo was collapsing houses, vanishing food stores, and rapidly spreading disease. You're probably familiar with other stories like this about invasive species and runaway growth, the cane toads in Australia, for example. These episodes of explosive growth usually have destructive consequences for the other flora and fauna in the region. And to us humans, they appear as a disturbance in the balance and the stability of nature's natural cycles. But what about when you are the invasive species, so to speak? What about when you are the species enjoying the burst of runaway growth? Because for us humans, the late 20th century has been a period of remarkable, booming growth. Since 1950, the human population has gone from 2.5 billion people to about 8 billion people. Our economic growth has been even more remarkable. Between 1950 and 2010, world GDP increased sevenfold. It is a remarkable burst of human creative activity. It's a real success story for us as a species, and this growth has lifted many, many millions of people around the world out of poverty, providing ample food, clean water, and electricity to people who need it. At the same time, it has dramatically increased our use of the world's resources. Worldwide freshwater use has tripled, energy use quadrupled, fertilizer use increased tenfold. Our footprint as a species on the earth is heavier than it has ever been. And there have been global consequences, which are now well known to us, right? Global warming, deforestation, soil exhaustion, ocean acidification, the introduction of plastics into the biosphere, species extinction, just to name a few. The same economic growth that has been such a boon to us has thrown natural systems out of balance all over the world, imperiling those systems on which we are as a species completely reliant. So our own story of runaway growth as a species has been a decidedly mixed blessing. And yet when it comes to the economy, says economist Kate Raworth, we are addicted to growth. Continuous, unending growth is not only assumed to be possible, it is the goal of our economic activity. It is the expectation for how successful economies function. Successful economies grow. Indeed, we have designed our economies and our society, not just to assume growth, but to depend on growth. I'm speaking here in an American context, in a Western context. Of course, it's not just in the West. To begin with, profit obviously is the engine that drives capitalist investment, and we rely on growth to deliver an adequate return on investment, right? But it's not just capitalists. Politicians rely on growth because it allows them to increase tax revenue without increasing the tax rate. A growing economy means more money for the government. But it's not just politicians. Citizens rely on growth for the same reason, because we want more social goods, but also we want more stuff for ourselves. And we're not so much in love with paying taxes either. So we rely on a growing economy to solve the problem of social investment for us. We also rely on economic growth to smooth over social anxieties, resentments, and inequalities. It was once said of America that every ordinary American regards themselves as a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. The cultural myth that every American can enjoy extravagant success and upward mobility, despite the reality, makes it seem as though the riches of the American economy are much more equitably distributed than they actually are. And so this cultural myth relies on the assumption of continual economic growth. Raworth notes that these days, now that the connection between growth and environmental harm and inequality is well known, Economists talk about growth differently. They talk about green growth and sustainable growth and resilient growth and inclusive growth. Choose any future you want, she says, as long as you choose growth. And so we fixate on the GDP, the annual measure of economic production, as the central measure that tells us whether we are succeeding or failing. And we have an assumption, even an expectation, that GDP will continue to go up forever. Forever? I mean, maybe we sense that that can't really be true. It can't go up forever. Maybe forever-ish, right? Close enough to forever not to have to ask the question, what comes next? What comes after growth? So in her book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, Kate Raworth has made it her mission as an economist to take on this gospel of growth. She wants to introduce a different metaphor for a successful economy. Rather than an arrow pointing upward like a curve that's just ascending up, 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 she proposes instead what she calls the donut model of economics. So, Raworth says the desirable level of global production is defined by 2 limits. There's a floor beneath which we fail to produce enough wealth to provide basic social support for all people. Then there's a ceiling above which our production stresses the environment, causes ecological harm, maybe even irreparable ecological harm. She calls these 2 limits the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. We don't want to fall through the floor where there's too little produced and people don't have the minimum that they need for a thriving life. But we also don't want to grow until we bust through the ceiling. When we grow beyond that sustainable ceiling, which she calls overshoot, we imperil the very natural systems on which the whole game depends. And we threaten human thriving in a different way, and really the thriving of all life. She says we should design our economies to hit a sweet spot in between. So Raworth actually draws these 2 boundaries as like an inner circle and an outer circle. And so you end up with a shape that looks kind of like a donut. And the goal is design your economy so that you are somewhere inside the donut. You are meeting everyone's social needs, but you are not destabilizing the environment that makes the whole donut possible in the first place. Now, to get there, Raworth has a lot of ideas, and one of them is that 21st century economies will need to become regenerative. Our existing economy, she says, is based on degenerative design. You take materials out of the earth, you shape them into what you want, you use the thing that you've made, and then you throw it away, right? Take, make, use, lose. Regenerative design builds sustainability into the production cycle. So it's as if part of building the car is thinking about how are we going to reclaim or reuse all of those resources that went into the car when we're done with the car? We ask that question up front. In regenerative economic systems, waste from one process is used to fuel another process. And the ideal is that nothing is lost. Of course, we know something is going to be lost. That's just the laws of thermodynamics, but less will be lost. The take, make, use, lose process assumes we can always make another thing. It is an extractive production process. We can always take more out of the earth if we need to. Regenerative design seeks balance. It does not assume we will keep using more and more over time. Raworth says we should be agnostic about growth. Sometimes growth is good. Sometimes it is not. But the economy in our societies should not be designed to require growth, and eternal growth at that, in order to function. We should not be running the forever race, where we must always be moving beyond the point where we were. The economy should be designed to support thriving human beings and thriving human communities, even when it's not growing. Cyclic processes do not need to grow to continue to function well. Growth in nature leads to maturation and balance. Natural systems are not designed to grow forever. In fact, as we've said, runaway endless growth in nature is usually a sign that something has gone wrong. And we have not escaped the gone wrongness of our own runaway growth. We see that in the environment all around us. Well, can we grow our way out of that problem? There is an idea that economic growth itself contains the solution to the environmental harm caused by economic growth. This is a very prevalent idea, right? The idea is that countries kind of make a big environmental mess while they grow their economy, but then they get sufficiently rich that they use all that new wealth to clean up the mess, right? Like America had a big industrial boom after World War II. We got rich in the 60s, and then we noticed that, oops, our rivers are on fire, so we passed the Clean Water Act. Problem solved. Well, the first problem with this idea is that we know that the environmental messes we create are not born equally. Pollution and other forms of environmental harm are visited disproportionately on the poor and on racial minorities, and those communities often lack the political power to force the larger society to clean up the mess that was made. So it's not as simple as saying we make a mess and then we clean it up, because that is not how it plays out. Oftentimes we make the mess and then we put that mess in a different zip code and then we call it good and pretend it never happened, right? The larger problem is that we are so far outside the environmentally friendly region of the donut in our economic growth that we are creating problems that are not fixable, not readily fixable. Problems like global warming, soil exhaustion, ocean acidification, again, mass extinction. These global problems do not have solutions in the same way that cleaning up a single river or lowering the smog over a single city might. We need to dramatically reduce our use of global resources, far more dramatically than we have to date. Is it possible to absolutely reduce our use of resources and grow at the same time? Is that even possible? Some green economists think, yes, it can be done. We can have growth and sustainability. Others are much more skeptical that we can reduce our use of resources at the level that we really need to and still grow globally, grow everywhere. But no one wants to say that out loud, because the necessity of growth is baked into our very way of life. And the idea of no growth is almost too threatening to contemplate. Growth is how we achieve social stability. When economies fail to grow, or worse, when they shrink, a whole host of undesirable political, social symptoms manifest, right? We see rising xenophobia, we see intolerance, we see political instability, fascism, even war. Economic growth is tied to eliminating poverty around the world. The growth of the last 70 years reduced poverty for millions, for many millions. The Department for International Development is unambiguous in saying economic growth is the most powerful instrument for reducing poverty and improving the quality of life in developing countries. In many parts of the world, economic growth is the fastest and surest way to lift large populations out of extreme poverty. And many of these countries, if given access to newer technologies, might be able to leapfrog some of the dirtier phases of development that other countries went through and build like greener and more sustainable economies from the get-go. So Raworth is not arguing against growth in every place. She is arguing against growth as a goal for all places, for everywhere, for forever. It's simply not sustainable. At some point, she says, our mental model of what a successful economy looks like must change. Now, getting past our addiction to growth would require getting past our consumerism and our idea that, of course, naturally we should have more stuff at the end of our life than at the beginning if we've done our job right. So imagine two different conceptions of what economic success means. The first, if we are wise stewards of our resources, then our resources should grow, like an arrow rising upward, drawing new resources out of the environment and adding them to our total accumulation. The second, if we are wise stewards of our resources, then our resources should maintain, returning to the earth everything that they take in a balanced cycle of use and regeneration that ends where it began. Now, mold that idea in your head as an economic success story That economic success could mean we collectively end the year with no more or less than we started, not an arrow pointing up, but a cycle that revolves. Not growth, but balance, stability, and harmony that respects both our boundaries and the boundaries of our environmental kin. This economic success story, ending where we collectively began, doesn't mean that individuals within this cycle could not experience greater prosperity. Remember, within that collective we, there are many who fall below the societal floor, the minimum of resources for thriving, right? There's poverty. And so Raworth says sustainable 21st century economies must be redistributive by design. We cannot endlessly grow our way out of poverty, then we need to find a different way to use our resources so that poverty might be eliminated. And she envisions much greater social investment, anticipating a kind of different return on investment. So part of transitioning to a post-growth world, if that's where we need to go, would be addressing the ills of social disconnection and meaninglessness that people experience in their lives, and finding new ways to build resilience in people and communities. Raworth again suggests alternate measures. There are indices of social happiness and well-being that have been developed that could perhaps be more fruitful measures of material success than just GDP growth. And we could focus our public investments on deliberately growing these measures within the economy instead of growing the economy as a whole and trusting that growth itself will do the job for us. Imagine if the nightly news reported on measures of social well-being as a national measure of economic success the same way it currently reports on the GDP. The GDP didn't grow this year, but poverty fell and household happiness is up 8%. What a fantastically good year for the economy. So, Unitarian Universalism isn't an economic theory. And thank God for that, you are probably saying right now. It doesn't have an economic dogma, nor am I proposing one today. What we do have are principles that call us to create justice in our societies, while also maintaining a healthy and respectful relationship with the larger web of life. And we also have sources that call us back to the wisdom of earth-centered traditions that speak to living in balance and harmony with nature. Like the circles of motion in Joy Harjo's poem, Eagle Song. Knowing that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things, and knowing that we are made of all this. What we can do as a religious community is ask different questions and imagine different possibilities. We can open up new stories about what success means and new stories about how we can live together and how we can live on the earth. And perhaps out of these new stories will come finally the world we dream of. May it be so, and amen.